There's a photograph in the Australian National Archives that shouldn't exist. Black and white, faded, taken sometime in the 1930s. Rows of children, maybe 50 of them, standing in front of a ship. They're dressed identically. Same shirts, same shorts, same blank expressions. No adults visible in the frame, just children. And beneath the photograph, in the careful handwriting of some long-dead bureaucrat, a single line notation. Arrived Sydney, no documentation, placed in care, no names, no ages, no countries of origin, just arrived Sydney. The children in that photograph had no papers when they stepped off that ship. No birth certificates, no passports, no letters of introduction. Most had no memory of where they came from. Some were too young to speak. Others spoke languages no one in Australia could identify. They were given new names by the institutions that received them. John, Mary, William, Elizabeth. Common names, English names, names that erased whatever they had been called before. This wasn't an isolated incident. Between the 1880s and the 1970s, thousands of children arrived in Australia under similar circumstances. No papers, no documented origins, no legal pathway back to wherever they'd come from. The official narrative calls this the child migration schemes. British children, the story goes, sent to Australia for a better life. Orphans and children from poor families, given opportunities in a new country. That's what the history books say. That's what the government inquiries concluded. But the evidence suggests something more complicated. Something that doesn't fit neatly into narratives about immigration policy or humanitarian rescue. Start with the numbers. Official records from the Australian government list approximately 130,000 child migrants arriving between 1869 and 1970. But these records have problems. Significant problems that become more apparent the closer you examine them. Gaps that span entire years. Inconsistencies where sending institutions in Britain record shipping children on specific dates, but Australian receiving institutions have no record of those children ever arriving. Years where the numbers don't match between sending and receiving institutions by margins of hundreds of children. Ships listed as carrying children that have no corresponding arrival documentation in any Australian port. Children recorded as arriving who then vanish from all subsequent records, appearing in no census data, no school enrolment records, no death certificates, nothing. The Australian Institute of Family Studies attempted to reconcile these discrepancies in 2001. They spent months comparing British and Australian archives, trying to match records, trying to account for the gaps. Their conclusion was deeply unsettling. The actual number of child migrants could be significantly higher than official records suggest. Perhaps as high as 150,000. That's 20,000 children whose arrivals might not have been officially recorded at all. 20,000 children who stepped off ships and disappeared into institutional systems with no paper trail. Think about what that means. 20,000 lives with no documentation, no proof they ever crossed an ocean, no acknowledgement they ever existed in official records. Consider how this worked in practice. A ship would arrive in Sydney or Melbourne or Fremantle. Children would disembark, sometimes dozens at a time, sometimes over 100 on larger vessels. Sometimes they came with an adult chaperone from whatever British institution had shipped them, a nurse or social worker who knew their names and had some paperwork. Sometimes they arrived alone, supervised only by crew members who knew nothing about them except that they were cargo to be delivered to a specific dock at a specific time. The crew had manifests, but these manifests often listed children simply as numbers. 50 children, 70 children. No names, just quantities. At the dock, representatives from religious organisations would be waiting. Catholic organisations like the Christian Brothers and the Sisters of Mercy. Protestant organisations like Barnardo's and the Fairbridge Society. Various denominations all running their own receiving programmes, all competing for children. The children would be sorted, sometimes based on documentation if any existed, more often based on snap judgments, Catholics to Catholic institutions, Protestants to Protestant ones. Those whose religion couldn't be determined, which was most of them, went wherever there was space. The sorting process could take hours, children standing on docks, exhausted from weeks at sea, being examined and divided like livestock at market. The receiving institutions had quotas to fill. They'd contracted with the British organisations to accept a certain number of children per year. These were legally binding contracts with financial penalties for non-compliance. More children meant more government funding. The Australian government subsidised these programs generously, paid per head for each child received and placed. The subsidy was substantial, sometimes equivalent to 6 months of an agricultural worker's wages per child. The institutions had powerful financial incentives to maximise intake. They had no financial incentive to maintain detailed records about where these children came from. The subsidy didn't require proof of origin, just proof of arrival and placement. A signature from a ship's captain confirming delivery. A signature from an institutional director confirming receipt. That was enough to trigger payment. The paperwork requirements were deliberately minimal. The Australian government could have demanded birth certificates, family histories, medical records. They demanded none of this. Why? Because requiring documentation would have reduced the number of children the institutions could accept. Fewer children meant less labour for institutional farms, less government subsidy, less political support for the programmes. The absence of documentation requirements wasn't an oversight. It was policy, a policy that benefited everyone involved except the children. What happened to the paperwork that should have existed? Every child crossing international borders should have documentation, birth certificates at minimum. If they were orphans, death certificates for their parents. If they were sent by institutions, transfer papers. If they were part of official migration schemes, government approvals. This paperwork existed in some cases, we know, because some of it survived. But for the vast majority of these children, no papers exist in Australian archives. And here's what's strange. The British archives have the same gaps. Children recorded as being sent to Australia have no corresponding documentation of their origins in Britain either. In 1998, the British House of Commons Health Committee investigated the child migration programs. They interviewed former child migrants, now elderly, many travelling from Australia at their own expense to testify. They reviewed archives in Britain and Australia, spent months sifting through whatever records still existed. They found that many British institutions that had sent children to Australia had destroyed their records, deliberately and systematically. Fire damage was the usual explanation given. Accidental fires in record storage facilities. But the pattern was suspicious enough that investigators began to question the accident narrative. Institutions across different cities, run by different organisations serving different denominations, all experiencing record-destroying fires within a few years of each other. All in the 1960s and 70s, just as questions about the child migration programs were beginning to surface in media and Parliament. Some fires were definitely accidents, but others showed signs of being deliberately set, fires that started in record rooms rather than other parts of buildings, fires that destroyed only documents related to child migration while leaving other institutional records intact. In at least 3 cases, investigators found evidence that records had been removed from buildings before fires occurred, then reported as destroyed in the fires. This wasn't destruction of evidence through negligence. This was a coordinated effort to eliminate documentation that could reveal what had actually been done. The Australian Royal Commission in 2001 heard testimony from former child migrants. The stories were remarkably consistent across different witnesses who had been in different institutions and arrived in different decades. Most remembered almost nothing about their origins before Australia. Their earliest clear memories were of ships, of seasickness, of arrival. A few had fragmentary memories of parents or siblings or places that might have been home. A woman remembered a kitchen with blue tiles. A man remembered a park with swings. Another woman remembered someone singing to her, though she couldn't remember who or what the song was. But these memories were suppressed by the institutions that raised them actively and sometimes violently. Children who asked about their families were punished, not just scolded, punished with beatings, with isolation, with withdrawal of food. Children who tried to remember, who talked about mothers or fathers or homes, were told they were orphans, that their parents were dead, that they had no one and never had. Even children who insisted loudly and repeatedly that they had mothers or fathers or homes were told they were lying, were making up fantasies, were being ungrateful for the care they were receiving. The institutional policy was clear and consistent across organisations. These children had no past. Their lives began the day they arrived in Australia. Everything before that was to be forgotten, erased, treated as if it had never existed. Why would institutions do this? The official explanation is that it was believed to be psychologically better for the children. A clean break from difficult pasts, a chance to start fresh without the pain of loss and separation. This explanation might make sense if the children had actually been orphans from abusive situations, but testimony from former child migrants suggests otherwise. Many described memories of having families, of being told they were going on a trip and would return, of parents who believed they were sending their children away temporarily. These weren't all orphans, and the institutions knew it. There's another explanation, one that connects to economic patterns in both Britain and Australia during this period, patterns that recur throughout industrial capitalism. Britain, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, had a problem that economic historians call surplus population. Too many poor children relative to the economy's ability to employ or support them. Workhouses were overcrowded to the point of crisis. Some housed twice or three times their designed capacity. The cost of caring for destitute children was straining municipal budgets across industrial cities. Manchester, Liverpool, London, Birmingham, all struggling with the same issue. Thousands of children whose parents couldn't afford to keep them, whose parents had died or disappeared, whose parents had been imprisoned or institutionalized. The Victorian poor relief system was breaking under the weight. At the same time, British colonies needed labour desperately. Australia in particular had vast land suitable for agriculture, but a critically limited population to work that land. The White Australia policy restricted non-European immigration. The solution became obvious to policymakers. Send the children to the colonies, frame it as humanitarian. Call it giving them opportunities, fresh starts, better lives than they could have in crowded British cities. But the economic reality underneath the humanitarian framing was simple labour transfer. Moving surplus labour from where it wasn't needed and cost money to maintain to where it was needed and could generate profit. The children were surplus in Britain, they became productive assets in Australia. Everyone benefited economically except the children themselves and their families. In Australia, these children became workers. The institutions that received them operated farms, often sprawling properties of thousands of acres. The children worked these farms from the age of 6 or 7. They received minimal education, just enough to achieve basic literacy and numeracy. 3 or 4 hours of schooling per day at most, often less. The rest of their time was spent in labour, agricultural work mainly, boys in the fields planting and harvesting, operating equipment, tending livestock, girls in dairies milking cows, in kitchens preparing food for hundreds, in laundries washing institutional linens. The work was hard physical labour, the kind normally done by adult farm workers. But children could be worked harder and longer because they lived on site and had nowhere else to go. The institutions profited directly from this labour. The farms produced income. Wool, wheat, dairy products all sold at market. The revenue went to the institutions. The children received no wages, not even token amounts. This wasn't called slavery because the children were technically in the care of charitable institutions. The legal framework was different. But functionally, it was a labour system based on moving workers who had no legal right to refuse work, no ability to leave, and no compensation for their effort. Some institutions made enormous profits. Records that survived show some religious organisations operating child migration farms that generated annual revenues equivalent to tens of millions in today's currency, all produced by unpaid child labour. The lack of documentation served multiple purposes. Without papers, children couldn't prove their ages. This meant they could be kept in institutional care longer than would otherwise be legal. Australian law required children to be released from institutional care at 18. But without birth certificates, how do you prove you're 18? The institutions decided. Some children who insisted they were adults were told they were younger, kept working for additional years. No one outside the institution could verify the truth. No papers meant no proof. Without papers, children also couldn't leave Australia. Even if they remembered having families in Britain, even if they wanted to return, they had no documentation allowing them to board ships. No passports, no birth certificates to apply for passports. No proof they were British citizens. They were stateless, in practice. trapped in Australia not by physical barriers but by bureaucratic impossibility. To leave a country, you need papers. They had none. The British government was complicit in this. When former child migrants, now adults, began trying to trace their origins in the 1960s and 70s, they encountered deliberate obstruction. Letters to British institutions went unanswered. Requests for records were denied. The official position was that records didn't exist or couldn't be located. Only after sustained pressure and eventually parliamentary inquiry did the truth emerge. The records had existed. Many had been destroyed. What remained showed a pattern of children being sent to Australia under false pretences, with origins deliberately obscured. Why obscure origins? If these were truly orphans or children from abusive situations being rescued, transparency would support the programme. The fact that transparency was actively prevented suggests the programme involved children who weren't orphans, children who had families, children who were taken under pretences, and whose families were told things that weren't true. Some families were told their children had died. Others were told their children had been adopted by wealthy families in Britain. The truth that their children had been shipped to Australia and put to work on institutional farms was concealed. There's evidence this happened systematically, not as isolated incidents. Former child migrants who eventually traced their origins, often after decades of searching, found living relatives who had been told they were dead. Parents who had been told their children died of illness, who had mourned them, who had held funerals for children who were actually alive and working on farms in Australia. Siblings who grew up believing their brother or sister hadn't survived childhood, who carried that grief their entire lives, only to discover in old age that their sibling had been alive all along on the other side of the world. The deception wasn't accidental. It wasn't the result of poor record keeping or communication failures. It required active coordination between British and Australian institutions. Required someone to tell families children were dead, while simultaneously shipping those same children to Australia and placing them in institutional care. Required maintaining the lie for years, even decades. Required rejecting inquiries from families who suspected they'd been deceived. This level of coordination suggests policy, not isolated incidents of institutional misconduct. Suggests that at some level, British and Australian authorities knew that families were being told lies, knew that children who weren't orphans were being shipped away, knew that documentation was being deliberately withheld or destroyed, and chose to allow it to continue because the economic benefits outweighed ethical concerns. The children were poor, their families were poor, their interests weren't considered important enough to interrupt a system that was solving expensive problems for both governments. The economic logic becomes clearer when you examine the finances in detail. British institutions received substantial payments from municipalities for each child they took from workhouses. These payments covered housing, food and care. But the payments continued even after children were shipped to Australia. The British institutions didn't report to municipalities that the children they were being paid to care for had been sent overseas. They continued collecting care payments for children who were no longer in Britain. Australian institutions received payments from the Australian government for each child they accepted, as already discussed. The children themselves generated income through their labour on institutional farms. Every stage of the process created revenue streams for someone. The only parties who received no economic benefit whatsoever were the children themselves and their families. This wasn't humanitarian aid or charitable work. This was labour trafficking structured to generate profit at multiple points, with bureaucratic sanction and government support at both ends. Consider the timeline of when this programme expanded most aggressively. The peak years were the 1920s and 1930s. This corresponds to post-World War I economic depression in Britain. High unemployment, massive numbers of destitute families, children in workhouses because their parents couldn't afford to keep them. At the same time, Australia was experiencing labour shortages in rural areas. Australian farming needed workers but couldn't attract enough adult migrants. Children were the solution. They could be trained into the work. They cost less to maintain than adults, and they had no ability to organise or demand better conditions. The religious framing was tactical. Presenting child migration as Christian charity made it politically acceptable. Both British and Australian governments could support it publicly. The media coverage was uniformly positive. Stories about giving poor children better lives, photographs of children in Australian sunshine, testimonials from institutional heads about the wonderful opportunities being provided. The reality of child labour on institutional farms was never mentioned. The absence of documentation was never questioned. The system worked because everyone benefited except the children. When did this end? Officially, 1970. The last organised child migration scheme shut down, but the reasons for shutdown weren't humanitarian. By the 1970s, Australia no longer needed agricultural child labour. Mechanisation had reduced labour demand. Adult migration from Europe was meeting workforce needs. The economic rationale for importing British children had disappeared. At the same time, questions were being raised. Former child migrants were speaking out. Media was investigating. The political cost of continuing the programs began to outweigh the economic benefit. The programs ended not because they were recognised as wrong, but because they were no longer profitable and were becoming politically problematic. What about accountability? The British government apologised in 2010. The Australian government apologised in 2009. Both apologies acknowledged that harm had been done. Both expressed regret. Neither apology included reparations. Former child migrants received no compensation for the labour extracted from them, no compensation for the childhoods taken, no compensation for the families they were separated from. The apologies were symbolic. They cost nothing. Some former child migrants attempted legal action, sought compensation through courts. These cases largely failed. The legal problem was statute of limitations. The abuse happened decades ago. Too much time had passed. Never mind that the victims hadn't known they could seek legal remedy. Never mind that the destruction of records had prevented them from even understanding what had been done to them until late in life. The courts ruled that too much time had elapsed. The institutions and governments that had profited from their labour faced no financial consequences. The deeper question is how this happened at all. How did two governments coordinate a system of mass child trafficking that operated for nearly a century? The answer is that it wasn't viewed as trafficking. It was viewed as social policy. The children were poor. They were from the lower classes. Their labour wasn't valuable in Britain. Exporting them to Australia was presented as solving multiple problems simultaneously. Britain reduced its poor relief burden. Australia gained labour. Religious institutions gained workers and government funding. Everyone benefited except the children, and their interests weren't considered important. This reflects a broader pattern in economic history. Labour has always moved to where it's needed. Sometimes labour moves voluntarily. People migrate seeking opportunity. Sometimes labour is forced to move. Slavery is the most obvious example. But there are intermediate categories, systems where labour movement is coerced but legally sanctioned, where the coercion is bureaucratic rather than physical. Child migration schemes fit this category. The children weren't enslaved in the traditional sense, but they also weren't free. They were trapped by lack of documentation in a system that extracted their labour without compensation. The revisionist interpretation of this history emphasises the economic function over the humanitarian framing. Yes, some children probably did benefit. Some probably were genuinely orphans from terrible situations who found better lives in Australia. But the system wasn't designed around their welfare. It was designed around labour needs and institutional revenue. The proof is in what happened to children who didn't work well or became sick or disabled. They weren't cared for more carefully. They were often sent to harsher institutions or simply disappeared from records. A system designed for humanitarian purposes would have protected its most vulnerable members. This system discarded them. Understanding this history matters because similar patterns persist. Modern labour migration systems often involve workers who have limited documentation, limited rights, and limited ability to leave. The specifics differ. The economic logic remains the same. Move labour from where it's surplus to where it's needed. Minimise the legal protections afforded to that labour. Maximise the economic benefit to employers and governments. The vocabulary has changed. We don't call it child migration anymore. But the underlying economic dynamics that made child migration profitable for nearly a century still drive migration policy today. For the individuals involved, the former child migrants now in their 80s and 90s, the apologies came too late. Most lived their entire lives not knowing where they came from, not knowing if they had families who remembered them, not knowing their real names or birthdays. The psychological impact of this erasure is difficult to quantify. Identity is built on continuity, on knowing where you came from. These children were denied that. They were told their lives began on a ship arriving in Australia. Everything before that was erased. Some adapted, built new identities, built lives despite this foundational absence. Others never recovered from it, struggled with questions they could never answer. The archives contain thousands of files on these children, institutional records that survived. What's striking is how similar they all are. Same format, same minimal information, name assigned by institution, date of arrival approximate, religion assumed, origins unknown. It's as if someone designed a form specifically to document people while revealing nothing about them. And perhaps that's exactly what happened. Perhaps the minimal documentation was intentional. A system designed to create workers while preventing them from ever reclaiming their histories. What this reveals about economic history is uncomfortable. We prefer narratives where economic development is driven by innovation and voluntary exchange, where people make free choices and benefit from the results. The child migration schemes show a different economic reality, one where vulnerable populations are moved to serve economic needs without their consent, where institutions profit from their powerlessness, where governments facilitate this because it solves fiscal problems. This isn't an anomaly. This is how labour markets actually functioned for most of history. The child migrants are just one visible example of a broader pattern. The question is what we do with this knowledge. The apologies have been made, the programs have ended, the survivors are elderly. But the economic logic that created these programs hasn't disappeared. It's been redirected into other forms. Understanding this history doesn't change what happened, but it might change how we think about current systems, about who benefits from migration policies, about what happens to people who lack documentation and legal protection, about the difference between humanitarian rhetoric and economic reality. The children in that photograph at the beginning, the one in the National Archives, they're all gone now, lived their lives, died without ever knowing where they truly came from. Their stories are lost except for what's preserved in testimony and archives, but the pattern they represent continues. The movement of undocumented labour, the erasure of origins, the economic benefit to institutions and governments, the cost borne by those with no power to refuse. That pattern is still with us, still shaping migration, still determining who moves where and under what conditions. The names have changed, the faces have changed, the fundamental economic logic remains exactly the same.